What is up, guys? We're going to be taking a look at this lab, Oauth account hijacking via redirect URI. In previous labs, we've seen vulnerabilities with the insecure implicit grant or implicit flow version of Oauth. This is actually the slightly more secure version, which is the authorization code grant flavor of Oauth. But just because it's more secure in general, if it's implemented insecurely, then it can still be vulnerable to attack. Now, in previous labs, we've seen that the first time we attempt to authenticate with the web app, we're redirected to the Oauth provider. We then sign in with the Oauth provider. We're then redirected back to the lab. Now, the difference is with the implicit grant version was sent with the bearer token, which we can use to make requests to the Oauth provider. The difference with the authorization code version is that we take a code from the Oauth provider, which we then give to the web app. And once we're already authenticated with the Oauth provider and we have the associated session cookie with the Oauth provider, on subsequent visits to my account where we attempt to log in, it detects that we already have a session cookie, we're already authenticated with the Oauth provider, so it immediately sends us to the redirect URI. And you can see in the browser URL bar, we have this code. So it's part of a redirect call to the web app. The web app can then use that code to make a server-side request to the Oauth provider and receive the bearer token, which can then use for subsequent requests to the Oauth provider. Now, let's just see that in terms of requests captured in Burp. First of all, we make a GET request to my account. The web app sees we're not authenticated locally with the web app, so it sends us to /social login. And /social login generates the next request, which is going to go to the Oauth provider. And we can see a copy of that here. It makes use of a meta tag to refresh the page, and you can see the URL. First of all, we provide the client ID. Now, that's generally always going to be the same because it's related to the web app and the Oauth provider. So it doesn't matter which user is making the request. The client ID will not change. We then have the redirect link. This is where the user's browser is going to be sent after the Oauth flow is complete. Of course, if we're already authenticated with the Oauth provider, we're going to get sent back to this redirect link almost immediately. Now, it's very important that the redirect link is validated by the Oauth provider against a whitelist of acceptable redirect links. Otherwise, the browser could be sent to evilhacker.net. And then we have response type equals code. So when we were looking at the implicit grant or implicit flow deprecated version of Oauth, this particular parameter was response type equals token, which could be used to make calls to the Oauth provider directly. Whereas now we're requesting a code, which can then be sent to the web app, so the web app can retrieve the token using the code. So this is going to be appended to the redirect link as part of the query string. And then we have the scope, so what we're requesting access to as part of the Oauth request here. So then the browser sends that specific request to the Oauth provider to /auth with the client ID and the rest of the parameters we've just discussed. And then we can see in response to that, it redirects us back to the redirect link. And you can see the code appended there as part of the query string. Now, unlike the client ID, the code is unique to the user, and this code can be exchanged one time only in exchange for the bearer token, which can then be used to make subsequent requests to the Oauth provider. So in all intents and purposes, this particular code is just as good as a password. It's only going to work one time, but if we were to have access to another user's code, well, we could use that as a one-time request in exchange for their bearer token, and hence we've taken over their Oauth account. Now we come to the reason why the redirect URI parameter is so important, because if this redirect link is actually an external domain, evilhacker.net, and we have the code appended as part of the query string, well, it's possible to eavesdrop on the code. If this is being sent to the wrong place, it's not being sent to the web app, it's being sent to evilhacker.net. Obviously, evilhacker.net can see the requests coming in, can see the query strings as part of those requests. Well, it now has access to that particular user's code. It can then use that code to log in with the Oauth provider via the web app. Now, as a little bit of proof of concept here, we've sent the request to the Oauth provider to the repeater in burp, and you can see the redirect URI. If we modify the redirect link, let's change it to evilhacker.net. What should happen now is the Oauth provider should not redirect the user's browser to evilhacker.net because it's not a whitelisted redirect link. Now, if we send that to the Oauth provider, notice no problem redirecting to evilhacker.net. So if we're listening to HTTP requests coming into that specific endpoint, we've just stolen the user's code, and it's still valid because it hasn't been used. It's only going to get used when it's actually sent to the web app. The web app's then going to make the subsequent call to the Oauth provider, but here it's being sent to evilhacker.net, so this is now an unused code which we can exchange for the bearer token. So with that said, you should have a working knowledge of all of the moving parts of this exploit, and the key problem is the fact that the Oauth provider is not validating this redirect link. So let's see how we can put this together as part of an attack. So for now, we're going to log out from Wiener's account and we're going to head to the exploit server. Now, keep in mind the exploit server represents the attacker controlled domain. And the idea is if a victim lands on the attacker controlled domain, well, if we have, for example, an iframe, we're able to manipulate the victim into making HTTP requests. So the idea here is we're going to manipulate the victim's browser into making an authorization request with the Oauth provider. So we have the client ID, we have a redirect link, which is the exploit server. Now, if you take a look at the lab walkthrough here, let's just copy the original unmodified payload just to get a feel for how you're going to need to modify this to end up with the final payload. So if we compare these side by side, first of all, your lab Oauth server ID needs to be replaced. Note this is not your regular lab ID. Remember, we're dealing with two endpoints here. We're dealing with the regular lab and we're dealing with the Oauth provider. So this is very specifically your lab Oauth server ID. So if you take a look at requests that are specifically sent to the Oauth provider, you can see it begins with Oauth. You can see the ID is here. This is different from the ID on the regular lab. So we have the lab ID and then we have the ID of the Oauth provider. Of course, they're both part of the lab, but they're different endpoints with different IDs. We also need our lab client ID. Now, we mentioned that the same web app is going to be using the same client ID, but there's really no guarantee that it's going to be the same for different instances of the lab. So you're going to specifically need to retrieve your lab client ID for this payload. So when we check out these GET requests to the Oauth provider, we can see the client ID is provided as part of the query string there. It's always the same, as you can see from these requests. So we simply need to copy that from one of the requests. And then finally, your exploit server ID, which is something different again. This represents the attacker controlled domain. So we actually have several different values that we need to input into the default payload that we're given by the Portswigger walkthrough here. So once you've swapped out all of the constants here for the correct values, you end up with something like this particular payload. So let's store that. Now, to retrieve the value for the exploit server, you can see here at the top, here is the URL for the exploit server. So that needs to be pasted into the appropriate location as well. So let's think about how this works. So the victim, and by the way, there are some assumptions being made here. So we are assuming that the victim is an admin of the web app, and we're assuming that the admin is also authenticated with the Oauth provider. So the admin doesn't need to manually enter their username and password to complete the Oauth flow. As soon as they visit the link in the iframe, the Oauth provider sees that the session cookie is set, there's an active session, it immediately directs the admin's browser to the redirect link. That just happens to be evilhacker.net, the exploit server, so that allows us to harvest the code. We're then going to use that code to authenticate with the web app as an admin, and then the objective of the lab is to delete the user Carlos. So now let's choose deliver exploit to victim. And the next stage is going to be to visit the access log. So we're pretending that we are looking at the back end of evilhacker.net and we're looking at all of the HTTP requests that are coming in to the web app. Let's head to the access log. The later requests are at the bottom and you can see we have a request to / query string code. This is the code of the admin user, which we can exchange for his bearer token, or we can send it to the web app. So let's copy this. Now you can see that we generally visit /Oauth callback, and then we have our code as part of the query string. So if we send that to the repeater, we're going to swap this out with the code that we received. Now I recommend that you don't dispatch this via the repeater. We're simply modifying the request here so that we can copy and paste it. If you send this via the repeater, it's going to use up your one-time usage of this code. So better to just copy this. We're actually going to paste it in the browser. So if you send it in the repeater, you might struggle to actually be able to access the admin side of things. So websecurityacademy.net /Oauth callback, and then we have the code which we've stolen from the admin user. You've successfully logged in with your social media account, and you can see immediately we have access to the admin panel. So what's happened here is we are visiting the Oauth callback route on the local web app. The web app sees that we provided a code as part of the query string. It understands immediately that this is a code that should be swapped for a bearer token. There's a server-side request where this code is dispatched. The bearer token is retrieved. That's then used in a subsequent call to retrieve profile information and to authenticate us as the admin user of the local web app. So now we have full access. We have a session cookie set for the local session with a web app. We can browse this site as normal, authenticated as admin. Now the objective is to delete the user Carlos, so let's just click the delete button. User deleted successfully, and we get the flag, congratulations, you solved the lab. So in summary here, although we've seen the more secure version of Oauth, the non-deprecated version, which is the authorization code grant, it's insecure because that redirect URI was not being validated against a whitelisted set of acceptable redirect links. So we have the ability to arbitrarily redirect users to any location, giving us the ability to steal that code. Now, just to understand the impact of this, we can see that the admin is still required to land on an attacker-controlled domain. So first of all, the admin has to be in the wrong place on a site that really he shouldn't be visiting. And second to that, he also needs to be already authenticated with the OAuth provider. And of course, he just needs to be an admin user of the site as well. So this is one of those attacks where you have to get a little bit lucky, but it's still a vulnerability nonetheless because the redirect link has to be whitelisted by the OAuth provider. So it's one of those attacks where if you leave it active for long enough, you may eventually get some hits and you may eventually compromise some accounts. So key mitigation here, ensure if you are the OAuth provider that you are validating the redirect link that's provided as part of the authorization with the OAuth provider. So in a weird way, this wasn't really the fault of the web app. This is actually a vulnerability that's occurring at the OAuth provider level where they're not properly validating that redirect URI parameter. Having said that, there is mitigation that can happen here at the web app level. So firstly, we can see that this flow works even when we don't initiate a login on the blog, because we can simply take the stolen code and just hit the /Oauth callback route. So in a well-defended web app, this is usually blocked by what we can refer to as state validation. So unless we've clearly initiated the login request, it's not possible to simply use a stolen code because the web app recognizes that something's not right with the state. This is the second half of a request where we haven't seen the first half of the request. So that's problem number one. We then have mitigation, which we can refer to as PKCE, and this is short for Proof Key for Code Exchange, and it's an add-on to the OAuth authorization code flow. It essentially prevents a stolen or intercepted authorization code from being usable by anyone except the party that started the login. So we have two different forms of mitigation. We have an understanding of the state. So we don't just have the second part of the login flow when we don't have the original part of the login flow. That happened somewhere else. And then we have this add-on referred to as PKCE. And the basic idea is when the login starts, the client creates a secret code verifier. It's a random string. A hash is taken of that random string and it's sent to the OAuth provider. And then later, when exchanging the authorization code for the bearer token, it's necessary to present that original code verifier. So if an attacker has simply stolen the code, he's not going to have access to the verifier, and therefore he's not going to be able to get access to the bearer token and he's not going to be able to compromise the Oauth account. So even in the case where it's the Oauth provider that's corrupted, the web app's somewhat innocent. They're just unfortunate to use an Oauth provider that hasn't done their due diligence regarding security. It's still possible to protect things at the web app level with decent state validation, and also using PKCE if available. So just in case you're curious about the technical details, the PKCE is standardized in RFC 7636, but Oauth 2.0 doesn't force every provider to implement it. So this is still something that's required from the Oauth provider itself. The only thing we can concretely do on our side as the web app owner is this state validation. So the state validation is generally going to revolve around the session token. And remember, even if someone is not authenticated, they can still have a session token. Their session token is just representative of an unauthenticated user. But the idea here is if the second half of the login flow has a different session cookie to the original part of the login flow, well, there's clearly something wrong there. This is not actually going to be a legitimate login request because it initiated in a different place to where it ended up. So we can conclude that something's not right with the request. Even if the code is valid, even if other values are valid, the attacker is generally not going to be able to have access to the victim's session token. So quick summary here, key mitigations. Make sure the redirect URI is validated by the Oauth provider. If possible, make use of PKCE, which is offered by many Oauth 2.0 providers, although not everyone. And then as the web app owner, we can make use of state validation to ensure the beginning of the Oauth flow matches up with the end of the Oauth flow. All right, hope it was helpful. Thanks very much for checking out the content. Catch you guys in the next lab.